We are going to get started here. My name is Randy McCarlson. I'm an Assistant Vice Chancellor in the Division of Student Affairs here at CU Boulder, and I am filling in for Christina Gonzalez this afternoon as the moderator of our panel titled Trigger Warning. This is a political correctness panel, and it is number 1712. In addition, for those of you in this room, I'm doing a new way of getting our questions to our panel members. And so audience members for this panel will be asked to submit questions either via text, or you can submit a question here in the room by using a 3x5 card. It is a trial format that we're trying this year. This is really trying to allow more of our online participants to engage in the process, as well as to improve the overall quality of our question and answer period. To participate in a text question, you first need to join our session. And if you think you might want to text a question, if you can get your phone out now, we're going to ask you to send a text message to the 5-digit number 22333, which is also illustrated on each side of our stage here. In the body of the message, you're going to need to type in the keyword UMCGMB, and then you'll get a confirmation message that lets you know that you're part of our session. In terms of our text messaging, just so that you know, you're going to have a limited number of words per text field, so we're asking you to be as succinct as possible. If you need to send more than one text message, we'll get both text messages, but we'll need to sort through on that. For our students, if you could let us know that you're a student in that text messaging so that we know that. And then if you would, and you want us to introduce your first name and location to be read aloud, please include that as well in your text message. If you don't have a cell phone or you're in this room and you just want to write your question, our producer, who's over here raising her hand, does have 3x5 cards and pencils. So if you want to have a written down card given to us, you can have her come by. She'll give you a pencil and a piece of paper, and you'll write down your questions. At the end of our panel, if you're still on the text messaging, what we ask you to do is to text the word leave, which will then exit you out of the room. If you don't text the word leave, you'll continue to see what's happening in this room after our panel. So we'll also repeat these questions and instructions after our panel introduces themselves, but we would like to go ahead and have our panel each introduce themselves, give you a little of their opening remarks, and then we will open this for question and answer.
My name is Malou Innocent. I'm an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute.
I'm Bill Martin. I'm the former athletic director at the University of Michigan and former president of the United States Olympic Committee.
Hi, I'm Sophie Karasik. I'm the Director of Education and co-founder of the National Survivor Advocacy Organization End Rape on Campus.
Perfect. We've asked each of them to prepare some opening remarks on our panel today, which again is trigger warning. This is a political correctness panel. So we're going to work down and have each of them give us a little introduction, and then we'll open it up for question and answer.
Great. So I have some prepared remarks, and I'm going to be looking down a bit when I'm talking just because I want to make sure I hit all my points. What I'd like to do is just discuss with you what I perceive to be political correctness and the ways in which I see political correctness and political incorrectness sort of permeate the political discourse. I think, first off, political correctness can be described as a temperament that tries to limit ideas that may hurt or offend or are upsetting to others. But I think it also goes a bit farther in the sense that political correctness, it tries to promote tolerance by attempting to restrict or control another person's language. And I think in many respects it's a good idea to try and limit how we describe others, especially those who are marginalized within society. It makes sense that we want to try and not necessarily police each other, but we want to sort of say things in a way that may not upset people unnecessarily. But I think these are sort of a good idea gone bad. And so I have like a general taxonomy, if you will, or classification of various ways I see political incorrectness in the political discourse. And I don't think it's one way. I see the use of euphemisms, intersectionalism, collectivism, cultural protectionism, also described as cultural appropriation, humor/sarcasm/parody, and also hate speech. So I'm going to go through the various classifications. And again, this is my classification, not someone who's a cultural anthropologist or anything. So I'm sure there are other ideas and classifications. But let me start with the first. I see euphemism as a way of describing political correctness, and that it describes a very painful or unpleasant thing or subject matter in a more pleasant way. So for instance, we don't call the deaf anymore, we call them hearing impaired. And that makes sense because words obviously can be very harsh, they can be very, very blunt, they can be somewhat offensive, and so we give them descriptions that have less or fewer negative connotations. Again, this is sort of a good good thing, but I think it can sometimes turn bad. I think sometimes what we see is we end up dancing around subject matters, and it sometimes can hide reality. It's like saying, that Mars has an oxygen deficit. Well, there is no oxygen on Mars. So we sort of dance around these things. And it also makes a mockery of what is serious and consequential, and almost makes a mockery of it. George Carlin, in his book Brain Droppings, he says, he can foresee the day, and I'm sure Sophie has an opinion on this, he can foresee the day when a rape victim is referred to as, quote, an unwilling sperm recipient, unquote. And I think that's sort of the problem with euphemisms, is that it makes a mockery of it. It demeans it. It belittles it. And I think that's sort of a problem of again, good idea gone bad. Another idea is intersectionalism. Raise your hand if you've heard of this term before. There we go. Okay, cool. So this is my crude definition of intersectionalism. Please feel free to write your protestations to the contrary on these cards later. But from what I understand, it was developed in the 1970s by African American feminists who thought that white feminists didn't really truly understand oppression. And what they thought was that, race and gender, it's a very complex web of advantages and disadvantages. So for instance, a white woman has the privilege of her race, but the detriment of her gender. Or a black man has the benefits of his gender, but the disadvantages of his race. And so in this context, black women are in double jeopardy because they face the disadvantage of being both a woman and being black. So that makes imminent sense. That makes total and complete sense. I think everyone in here could say that's intuitively very appealing and understandable. Again, this is a good problem gone bad. I think what we see sometimes is people in the victimized class, they begin to feel that they can do to others in the privileged class what was once done to them. So you see the shaming, the silencing, the belittling of those who are in the privileged class, where we all deserve the right to have an equal say in the conversation. Another example is collectivism, in the sense that I think people have the right to speak as a group. I think you can voluntarily join groups and voluntarily withdraw from groups. And I think people who belong to a group, they should determine how they define themselves. So I think one way this could be problematic, unfortunately, is when the group identity begins to compete with the individual. And you see that people have a right to speak as a group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it trumps everyone's individual right within that group to speak out. Another example I would have would be cultural protectionism. It's called cultural appropriation. It's the idea that the adoption or use of elements of one culture by someone who's outside of that culture. I call it cultural protectionism because I feel that it's almost a monopoly on culture. I look at culture as being, something about someone's identity, but it's also something that's very fluid and dynamic. But I think the problem with cultural appropriation is that it becomes so extreme, it's almost conservative. It's saying there's only one way to define this culture. There's only one way to express it. There's only one group of people who can express that. I think it's problematic, obviously, if we say we can't have cultural appropriation. We wouldn't have math because it came from the Arabs. We wouldn't have gunpowder because it came from the Chinese. We wouldn't have the Rolling Stones because they were influenced by American blues. So where does this, when you take it to its logical extreme, it becomes very conservative in some ways. And I think another form of political correctness is humor / sarcasm / parody. And I'm going to say a joke. This is only a joke. Please don't get offended. So comedian, sure you've heard of him, Bill Maher? Yeah. So he has this joke. He says, Islam, it's the religion of peace. There's a piece of you over here. There's a piece of you over there. So the thing that we like about sarcasm and parody and humor is that you can give voice to an oppositional dynamic within the culture, right? So it allows you to cut through the nuance in many ways. It's almost the antithesis of euphemisms. It's really just cutting directly, and it allows you to say things and give a license to say something that's very subversive. I think the problem with that, of course, is that it can easily go in the other direction, and you could begin offending people left and right. One example would be, who's in here has heard of the drinking game Beirut or beer pong? Oh, there we go.
There you go.
So one of my good friends, Brian Hines. Hi, Brian. You're probably watching. So his old roommates, they'd play beer pong, and if you're unfamiliar with beer pong, you have to align your drinks in a certain formation, and the opposing team has to dunk ping pong balls into your cups. And so with each dunk, you have to rearrange your cups. So my friend Brian, his roommates, called one cup Rosa Parks because they drag it from the front of the table and dragged it to the back. So yeah, exactly, it rubs you the wrong way. So I think humor and parody, hiding behind that, it's not funny. Again, it can make light of something. It also, I think what's problematic with humor in political correctness is that it can reinforce already generalized stereotypes that exist. and then you have this sort of othering where it almost reinforces the qualities within that group, and it also gives voice to those very crude stereotypes. And I think what's even worse with humor is that those who do get offended, the people who say it say, oh, don't, take it lightly, or don't be so sensitive. So it's a further way of jamming the knife, of saying, oh, you're too sensitive, you're too ultra sensitive, you're not funny enough. And so that's the way I think that it could also be problematic. Another one is, of course, lastly, hate speech, which oddly enough I think it's good. We have rights that protect free speech. Hate speech is also protected speech. I'm an absolutist when it comes on free speech. I also understand that we as a society must be responsible. We must have, as I said in the previous panel, a well-informed citizenry. So that means being responsible with our rhetoric. But honestly, you can demean and stigmatize and verbally be abusive to people who are Mexican or black or Republicans or Democrats or socialists. Hate speech is protected speech, and maybe that's problematic. Of course, if you have the threat of imminent harm, that's not protected speech, but for the most part, hate speech is protected. I think overall, those are sort of my comments. If you have questions, I look forward to hearing them.
Wow. I didn't know I had 10 minutes of prepared remarks, but here it goes. I also didn't know that I almost was going to live without the Rolling Stones. So it's nice to know that that didn't happen. So my life I've spent principally in the private sector, but along about 2000 I got tapped to be athletic director at the University of Michigan, so I ended up spending 12 years in higher education as an executive officer and an athletic director. And I will tell you, political correctness, as we all really know what it is in our gut, is alive and well at the University of Michigan and probably every other campus in the United States today. I can tell you when I would travel uphill from the athletic department at the bottom of the hill to the central administration office, I had to throw my political correctness switch so that I made certain I didn't use inappropriate language, didn't offend any group, and so forth. I want to share with you a couple of stories and incidents that have happened on campuses today, and I'm going to keep my remarks principally to athletics and universities, since that's my experiences, but I know the comments go well beyond the academy. Last week, we had a very well-known and respected journalist, female, Kathy Young from the East Coast. She's written for Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, come and talk about free speech in our country. Very interesting, even with the name Kathy Young, she grew up in Russia, in Moscow. And I'm going to quote from the reporter of the Michigan Daily and what he said about her comments a little bit. And he said, she said, coming of age in the Soviet Union and the ways Russia restricts radical and controversial free speech. She connected the country to the college campus, saying the necessary to conform to the dominant ideology is prevalent and reminds her of the strict conditions for free speech in the Soviet Union. Wow, that's pretty damn scary, isn't it? But I think that's where we are in many college campuses today, although it's probably politically incorrect to talk about that on college campuses today. But in this atmosphere, I think we should talk about it. I just think we're over the top in political correctness. I think we should say what we want to say, and yeah, this is a constitutional fundamental right we have in our country, and I think we should support it and protect it. I was interested in what the origins of the term was, political correctness. Anybody know what it is or where it was? From the 1700s. Well, somebody sent me something just the other day. I didn't bring it because it's politically incorrect to mention it, but I'll tell you how you can find it. This was a series of telegrams between President Harry Truman and General George MacArthur upon the surrender of Japan in 1946. And if you Google that exchange, you can find it in the Truman Presidential Library. There was not one four-letter word in our vocabulary that wasn't used in that particular series of telegrams. It was very enlightening, and the author who sent it to me is, I finally found where political correctness began. It began in the White House. Well, who knows? I think I'm going to be very interested in what you hear about the 1700s and where it began. But I really think we all got to relax a little bit. Just, let a little bit run off your back. And let's just be a little bit easier, on each other. Let's not burden each other with having to be so sensitive every single minute of the day. When I would walk back down the hill in Ann Arbor from an executive staff meeting, I could throw that political correctness switch off. I found that my discussions among our staff in athletics, male, female, black, white, Asian, you name it, we were so open and honest with one another that there were no problem saying exactly what you wanted to. I really thrived and enjoyed that particular environment. It was open, it was honest, and I think we need it throughout the college campus. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a different take on political correctness, which I prefer to call treating other people with respect. So I am very active in preventing and trying to encourage schools to respond in more appropriate ways to sexual violence and harassment. That's primarily where my expertise is. But I also was on a college campus fairly recently. I just graduated in August 2015. And I think that what people have been saying about college campuses being like really sensitive areas where people can't talk about anything is really overblown. I think that it's just, I think it's actually the opposite, where it's not that we are being coddled or that we don't want to be made uncomfortable, but rather it's that we want to make sure that we feel respected on campus and that we don't feel like we are learning in a hostile environment that is not respecting our humanity. So for example, I think that it's really, really offensive when I'm sitting in a class and somebody talks about rape in a really callous way without giving me any warning whatsoever. As someone who has gone through a sexual assault, I would like to have some sort of warning when you're going to discuss that material because of the impact that it has on me in the classroom. That is not something that has no effect. It actually can, make it really difficult for people to learn if all of a sudden they're being brought back to one of the potentially worst experiences that they've ever had. And it's not that we're asking for censorship either. We're not saying, oh, we don't want to discuss rape or we don't want to discuss incidents that could be upsetting. No, actually, we do want to discuss them. We want to make sure that people are aware of our history, that we are bringing light to the issues that marginalized people face. We want that to be discussed. That's part of dismantling those systems. But we want to make sure that we're doing so in a way that is not making students feel even more isolated and silenced. And that's why we want to have these kinds of warnings so that we can prepare ourselves when there's going to be this kind of adversarial discussion and making sure that we can be prepared for that. I also want to make sure that we're recognizing that we're not trying to talk about issues that we're not, or that we're not trying to censor and protect people from being aware of particular issues. The people who are asking for trigger warnings and the people who are trying to make sure that there's more respect on campus are people who have gone through these kinds of experiences, and it's not that they are like completely unaware and don't want to be aware of these various issues that affect particularly marginalized communities. Like for example, with sexual assault, I know a lot about sexual assault because I was sexually assaulted. I do not need you to tell me what you think sexual assault is as a professor of mine, and that I am going to be somehow not able to learn because I want a trigger warning for that content. I think that we should recognize that people are experts in their own lives, and that we should really make sure that those people feel like they can actually voice their opinion in class if necessary, but that also if they don't feel safe there, that they can talk to the professor afterwards about the material if need be. I also want to touch on that I think it's something that is going on a lot in the political realm right now, and I want to make sure that we bring that up, that Donald Trump is basically running on a campaign about being anti-politically correct. And I think it's important to be aware that a lot of people who come from marginalized communities are really scared of Donald Trump because of the things that he's saying about various people from various identities, and that might not be so real to people who are very privileged in society and don't necessarily have to worry about that, but for people who are potentially being told, you know, we're going to deport you from this country, we don't want to allow people of your faith to come to this country, things like that really do resonate, even if they might seem very outlandish and not realistic. Those are things that really do impact you mentally and make you feel like you're not welcome here. So I really want people to recognize that it does have an effect if you feel like you're not being respected and that your experiences are not being validated, that in an educational context really can impact how well you learn and how you feel as a member of that institution. And then lastly, I would say that the plural of anecdote is not evidence, and I think we've had a lot of anecdotes in the media about political correctness, and so I want to share with you that actually there was a study that was done at Cornell University where they divided students into several groups, and they asked people to think about political correctness as a primer for another discussion. And they found that actually once that the group that had been primed on political correctness, actually they now had a framework for the expectations for the discussion. And that because they had that framework, there was less uncertainty. And that as a result, more people ended up sharing their ideas, and overall it was a more creative discussion because people understood the expectations that were there. And so I really want to push back against this idea that that treating people with respect will make institutions more insular, and I encourage you to think more about how this actually is an opportunity to make us uncomfortable about the society in which we live and to reflect on how we can change it.
So we'll now open it again for questions. If you're in the audience and you would like to write down a question, our producer will bring around cards, so go ahead and raise your hand. We will go in terms of the idea around looking at our election right now. A student did write in and wanted to know from the panel, how does political incorrectness in our today's election affect the safety of minorities in the United States, in particular our Muslim American individuals?
I'll take a crack at it, and I'm sure you both will too. I think for me, the problem isn't necessarily the rhetoric in and of itself. I think the fact that the rhetoric is giving voice to people and it's allowing them, it's giving them the permission to lash out violently. No one would disagree that there's Islamophobic people in America, or people who are anti-black or anti-Mexican. It's a fact that it's a contender for the Republican nomination who's giving voice to that and giving credence to that and giving legitimacy to those voices. That's what I think is the problematic portion, is that by giving it legitimacy, that's where you see the attacks and the riots at the various campaign events. I think that's very problematic, and that's perhaps why you see so many people very fearful of Donald Trump and his rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. I think that it's very scary to see someone who is gaining so much traction, largely because of the remarks that he's made about people of color, women, variety of other groups, and that has actually, as we've been seeing increasingly in the media, that has given some people the courage, for lack of a better word, that I can't think of right now, to actually lash out violently against people. So I think it's important to also remember that words and language do have meaning and do affect us, sometimes subconsciously.
Another student wrote in and wanted to know, in terms of each of you spoke about this, but where do you believe the line exists with language being respectful towards others versus being overblown?
I think it depends on intentionality, honestly. I mean, how many times have you had a friend who said something in a very joking way to you, and you understand that it's a friend, so you know that it's not coming from a bad or malicious place? I think that's sort of the problem, is that when you overhear two people talking, and they're saying N-word this or N-word that, I mean, those two people might know each other and it could just be joking around, or it could just be like they're about to go to a KKK rally. I mean, so you don't know. I think intentionality matters so much. And that's my example with humor / sarcasm / parody, is that oftentimes it gives voice to those oppositional voices within society. And so okay, you can say something that's subversive in a humorous manner, that's fine. It's the intent behind it. It's if someone says something and they actually really mean it, like how often have you heard the N-word and it's actually meant? I mean, that really rubs you the wrong way. So I think intentionality matters.
Yeah, I just simply agree with that. You've said it all. Thanks.
Thanks.
I actually think that impact matters more than intent. So I think if you take sexual harassment, for instance, if you're making somebody feel like it's a hostile environment for them to work or get their education, then it doesn't really matter whether they had the intent to sexually harass you. They still did it. They still impacted you mentally. That still had something that impacted you and made you feel like you weren't safe there. So, I think it is important to think about the intentionality in terms of how do we move forward from this and make sure that we're educating people about, not to say the N-word and other slurs like that. But I think that the impact is something that we actually should be paying more attention to.
And the impact varies from person to person, too. So you never know when you say something what your impact is going to be on that individual. I've always felt I don't talk anything about somebody's physical condition. I don't talk to them about their race. I don't talk to them about their clothes. I don't do anything because I don't want to have a negative impact on them. And I've had those experiences where I have had a negative impact in the past. And it just, we're not going to have a perfect world on this. We really aren't. And so it goes with both parties to be a little bit more sensitive about it. But I just think we've gone too far in general.
We have been asked online multiple times if our panel can actually clarify what they define as a trigger warning, that we never did that. So.
Sure. Essentially, I think of it as a type, I think of it as a warning that there's going to be some sort of content that could be difficult for people, that could be sensitive. So for example, when you are, so people do this all the time in various contexts. So for instance, say you're a doctor and you're about to tell someone that they have cancer. You're gonna probably couch that with something along the lines of, you may want to sit down for this, or maybe we should pick a time to talk about this important subject that would be good for you. And so basically couching whatever information you are about to give with a piece of information that lets somebody know to expect that.
Others?
I'd never heard the term trigger warning until I saw what the panel is. So thank you for giving me one explanation as to what it is. To me, it's the whole issue is, how sensitive should you be with whoever you're dealing with on a face-to-face basis? And respect them. Yeah, you don't want to trash them in terms of what you say. I love that example of a doctor. Oh my gosh, I wouldn't want to say, well, you better sit down, or is there a better time that we talk about this? No, doctor, let's talk about this right now. What's my problem? Yeah. And go with it from there. But I get the point very much so.
I don't know. I have some mixed feelings on this. I mean, I agree and respect totally what Mel and Sophie are saying, but I mean, I'm offended every day. I'm not going to expect people to stop what they're doing. So, I mean, should people be protected by other people's language? No. We operate in an environment that's very difficult. People have differing opinions. A lot of people have opinions that are different than my own. I don't think I should feel obligated to demand other people stop what they have to say. I mean, they say that political correctness is tyranny with manners. Again, I'm sympathetic to the argument that we should be respectful. I totally understand that, but I think it could run away with us, and then it just becomes something that pisses everyone off.
Yeah, did I tell you I didn't like the way your hair looks today?
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah, right. Oh, thank you, sweetie. Oh.
Around the trigger warnings, we're getting lots of questions that are being asked around who would make up such a list. What defines a trigger warning? Who defines that? By what framework? And if we can also understand around, are there lists? Are these rules on college campuses? Does someone define that this is what it means?
I don't know if I'm going to answer the question directly, but I think it goes to one of the terms I had in my classification system here, this very rudimentary classification system of collectivism. I think that people within a group deserve to define how they define themselves. For instance, for a long time, people of color were called colored or Negro or black, and now it's African American. So they should define how they define themselves, and that's fine. I think that's probably the best way to sort of answer that question, but I think it's up to them.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think that many people would define themselves in different ways, and that we should be respectful of however someone wants to be defined. I mean, oh no, now I forgot what the question was.
It's a tough topic.
Yeah.
What was the question again?
So they're wanting to know who writes the list of trigger warnings. How do we
Okay.
define what's a trigger warning?
Yeah,
and, And also the other one that kind of goes along with that is if you never know the impact you are going to have, how can you give a trigger warning?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is a difficult issue, and I think we have to really be aware on a case-by-case basis. This isn't something that we can really set hard and fast rules for, but I think you should really use common sense. If you're going to be talking about an issue like sexual assault or lynching or other things that could potentially bring up really, really uncomfortable feelings, that should hopefully be common sense to you. I mean, in terms of what professors should and should not do, I mean, again, I think that it's up to them, that it's really hard to say a set list of all of the possible things in the world that we need to have trigger warnings for. But, I think it's common sense that people should know that something could potentially be difficult for somebody to hear, and that they should, have some sort of notice that that is going to be discussed.
Other thoughts?
I think it's a tough question because, who am I to set the parameters on acceptable speech, right? So, if I say that my limit is hearing something about Mexican minorities in America, for someone else it could be something else. So I mean, who defines this? Who defines what the trigger warning is? Who defines what politically incorrect statement will go over the line? I think it's very difficult. But I think this also gets to the humor / sarcasm / parody example that I gave earlier, is that sometimes we want to say things and we want to say it because we were free to express them, but we don't understand how it could reinforce generalizations or very crude stereotypes. And so I think it's very tough. I have very mixed opinions on this. I mean, overall, my default is very pro-free speech and very First Amendment. But I think it is very difficult because we do have sensibilities and we don't want to, offend people unnecessarily.
And I mean, going back to something that I mentioned before, it's not necessarily that we don't want to learn the material. It's not that we want necessarily to have this be censored from our lives and to be coddled. It's that we want to make sure that it's happening in a way that we feel is not, re-traumatizing and really difficult to sit through.
In terms of then the political correctness, what we're getting a lot of is the understanding of if we're being politically correct or we're not being truthful or honest or somebody put blunt, then are we steering clear of all difficult conversations? Not trigger warnings, but political correctness as a way of shielding and not engaging in difficult conversations in a true manner. So that's come across multiple times.
I think that's a statement more than a question, and I think it's absolutely true. It is what it is. And I go back to the Constitution and the First Amendment, and, that's the law of our country. And if somebody gets offended by something, they're just going to have to live with it. Yeah, you want to be sensitive to a certain extent. You don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, but there's a limit to it. I don't think any of us in this room can define that limit today at any time. It's a one-on-one situation. But I think we all have to recognize what our constitutional rights are and that we respect them.
There's something at our, Sophie and I went to the same college, UC Berkeley, go Bears. And there was something recently, there was a panel discussion with the drummer from Metallica, Lars Ulrich, and the founder of Salesforce, I forget his name off the top of my head.
Mark Benioff.
And what?
Mark Benioff.
Oh, Mark Benioff. You saw this, the story then. It was a heckler's veto. I guess some folks in the crowd didn't agree with certain statements that were being made, and so there was an attempt to basically stop the panel, as if one of you came up here and began attacking one of us because he didn't like what we had said. And they called this the heckler's veto. Again, I'm very much an absolutist on First Amendment rights and on free speech, so I think I should be able to say something, and Sophie, if she disagrees, should be able to say it as well, and she could protest all she wants. What I don't agree with is me trying to stifle her if we disagree. That's, I think, where it becomes problematic, is when someone of a disadvantaged group or a victimized class feel that they have not only just control of the people's behavior, but that they can sort of veto what that person says and that they have no rights. Everyone has an equal basis in the conversation. We're all coming from an equal playing field, I think.
I'd actually disagree a little bit with the coming from an equal playing field part, and I guess I would use the example of women who speak out about sexual assault and fear retaliation from online trolls, largely from Twitter and other social media platforms. I think that there is a silencing effect when a lot of people come out against a survivor of sexual assault and say, oh, well, you're making false accusations, or you're overblown. This whole thing is not something that we should really be taking seriously, and that actually, even though you could say that that's protected speech, that does have a silencing effect on whether people actually want to come forward with their speech. So I think that theoretically we can say that everyone is on the same playing field with regards to speaking, but I think that particularly when you have people from a very dominant group speaking very loudly, that people who are marginalized have concerns that are invalid or experiences that are invalid, that can have a silencing effect in of itself. So what does it really mean to have free speech if you don't feel like you're free to speak to your experiences?
In terms of political correctness, we have a question from a student that would like to know how you all think political correctness should be enforced, or if you do, or how it should be educated around in terms of society. So we educate around what it is, we talk to students about what's appropriate, not appropriate, but they want to know around enforced, and then how do we educate?
I think unless it's a very extreme case, people shouldn't be held criminally liable for what they say. Unless you have, again, the threat of imminent harm, things that are very much not protected by the First Amendment, then fine. But I think, honestly, society has these parameters in terms of how we define something that's politically correct or politically sensitive. It's very difficult to make a joke about, Abu Ghraib, to someone who may be from Iraq. Not to say that because of, the torture and the extraordinary rendition and the black sites and what have you. So, how we use language, I think it depends on what we consider to be socially acceptable, and that evolves over time. Again, the example I gave earlier, how groups define themselves, those change over generations, so I think it just evolves naturally, but I don't think anyone should really be held criminally liable.
Absolutely not on that, and it is a matter of the various social groups that we all belong to. I think political correctness varies by what audience we're talking to or what social group we're a member of or our family and so forth. And it just is what it is in society today. And it does evolve over time, and we do change. But we just can't stop talking and expressing our views. I can tell you, student athletes, they come in as a freshman, we talk to them about the subject of respect. We talk to the men about respect for women, how they should treat them, right down to opening the door, holding the chair for them at the dinner table, because we think that's a part of our culture. We think it's important to train them in all of those factors. Some of them get it, some of them never do, It is the way it is. But that's a part of our society. I just don't think we can legislate every little segment of our life as that we interact with our fellow beings.
I just think that what we're asking for is really not as extreme as people are making it out to be. I think that generally we're asking to feel, again,
Who's we?
I think, okay, so speaking for myself then,
Okay.
as a student, a recent graduate and somebody who went to school with a lot of people who felt similarly. And a lot of the time when we're talking about these issues, we're referring to college campuses in particular. So as somebody who's recently on a college campus, I don't think that it's as extreme as we're making it sound. I think that we're actually asking for things that are pretty rational in terms of trigger warnings, that we're just asking for, some sort of information that something's about to happen. And then with regards to other issues, we're asking that we not be made to feel like we're unwelcome on that campus and being hostily targeted. So I don't think that that's particularly outrageous. I think you can find certain extreme examples and you can talk about those, but I don't think that that's representative of what's going on. I think that, in fact, people want to feel safe on campus and want to feel like they're in a learning environment that is welcome to them and that they can actually speak freely. I think a lot of the time when people think about free speech, there's this notion that it's, being free to voice opinions that are racist or sexist or other things like that, and being free to do that. But I think we should also think about it in terms of being free to talk about your experiences that you've experienced, potentially as somebody who belongs to a marginalized group, and that you might not feel like you're able to do that because of the very loud voices from a more dominant group on that particular campus.
From our audience, we want to know, does the platform and position of power an individual has in our society affect how politically correct someone should be and how they give trigger warnings? So their platform or position of power within our society, individuals, does that affect how politically correct they should be or how they give trigger warnings?
Well, one of the examples I gave was the intersectionalism that some of you know about. There's actually called intersectional feminism, and it's the notion, again, that certain disadvantaged groups, they have deeper insight into oppression and how it operates in society because they deal with those pressures every day. So there is something to be said about what Sophie said earlier about, not everyone is coming from the same upbringing or history or historical background, and so we have to recognize that. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it could run amok where people of the disadvantaged class can begin trying to veto or silence or shame those of the privileged class because they have an opinion about that subject matter. I think that's when it becomes problematic.
Yeah, it's a tough question for me to answer, because we're dealing with a theoretical question. Give me an example that I can respond to in terms of who's got power over who and what trigger warnings before they talk they should give. It's difficult, and it just gets back to how we deal with everybody on a day in and day out basis.
Well, I mean, if you take the example of Donald Trump, or somebody who would be running for or becoming the next president of the United States, should they be held to a higher standard? I certainly think so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Tighten your sphincter muscles, everyone.
We have a question from a student that would like to know, when receiving a trigger warning, how does it help you prepare for an uncomfortable topic or conversation?
I've never gotten a trigger warning.
Yeah, I've never had one.
Sophie?
If you've ever had a trigger warning, how
If I give you a trigger warning and I say, here's my trigger warning, then I give you my statement, then how does that help you prepare for that uncomfortable topic?
Yeah. Well, so there are a couple of ways that you can do this. So it kind of depends on when you're actually giving the trigger warning. So for professors, for instance, if it's on a college campus, having that information be in the syllabus could be a way of giving somebody advance notice that that topic is going to be discussed that day. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're being cut out of the conversation. There are other ways that you can engage with that material. For instance, you could go to the office hours of the professor or email them to talk about the subject privately so that you're not, feeling like you have to relive whatever trauma it was in front of all of your classmates. So I think that it really does come down to making sure that people are aware of it ahead of time. I think that we can't expect that trigger warnings are supposed to be given 20 minutes beforehand and that then, that'll end up solving everything. I think that there needs to be some sort of advance notice for that. And certainly when that has happened, in my experience, when people have given trigger warnings on potential articles and things like that, I have appreciated that, because then, I don't have to necessarily think about sexual assault and rape if I don't want to in my particular case.
That can happen in the academy, in the university setting, where you're in classes and where you're in conferences of this nature. But out in society on a day in or day out basis, that doesn't happen. And so, I'm kind of outside. I'm not in the academy any longer. And so I think about how we treat each other on a daily basis. And not that what you said I disagree with. I'm just saying it's not reality for the majority of people the majority of the time. But I sure respect what you're talking about in this setting.
I think I would go back to the example of the doctor again, and then also thinking about ratings for television, realizing that there are ways that you can couch information that you're going to give somebody in everyday conversation, and just thinking before you speak. But you can still speak, but thinking before you do.
What about ratings in television?
With ratings in television, it's a warning that you're going to have some sort of sensitive material that comes to you.
Okay. I thought you were talking about Nielsen ratings.
We want to know, do you all believe that politically correct environments can limit the knowledge and understanding for people?
Well, I think it certainly can. I think it could limit artistic expression as well. I mean, I don't know how old you all are, but some of you may remember, the photographs by, what was his name, Mapplethorpe, what was it, the Piss Christ, where it was like, the crucifix in a jar of urine. That was offensive to many people in the Catholic Church, was up in arms, but it was also art. So who defines art? Who defines what is socially acceptable and what is not? And I think that's extremely difficult. And so I think it can be limiting. I think it's also very limiting if you have, we've seen this before with book publishers, where they refuse to publish certain things that they find incendiary or subversive. So then you have, big corporations and conglomerates who are basically trying to silence free speech. And so then it not only does it limit free speech, but also limits artistic expression. So I think it's very difficult.
A comment that I will make is somewhat related to it, and you see it across America today on college campuses. Whenever there's a recruitment for a new professor, a new faculty position, a new administrator, they always want a diverse pool of candidates, right? It's the way we do it all the time. And that diversity takes place in the pool, but what happens about diversity of ideological thinking, politics? Our country's kind of divided, not 50-50, but close to it, Republican, Democrat. But if you look on college campuses today, what do we have? Probably 98% Democratic votes, 2% maybe Republican votes. I really think the universities have done a poor job of making certain that kids get an opportunity to see viewpoints from both sides of the spectrum today. You just don't see it today. When it comes right down to it, they want uniformity of thought, and it's always on the left, not the right. We have a saying in Ann Arbor, you speak left and you live right.
Talk classy, act nasty.
Yeah.
So we have striving to be politically correct seems to be progressing in our society, and increasingly it seems to be hindering essential conversations. Even if that's not its goal, is there a future where this continues to be the point of effectively limiting our free speech?
I believe it was John Stuart Mill who talks about, he's a political theorist and philosopher, who says, there's government coercion and there's societal pressures. And oftentimes societal pressures can even be more impactful on the individual than government coercion. And I think this could be a very shining example of that. I think through discourse and through debate and through argumentation, you actually arrive at the truth. I think we can't arrive at truth unless we have the ping-ponging back and forth of ideas. But again, I don't want to mischaracterize what Sophie's saying. I don't think it's that she doesn't want to have these difficult conversations. I think it's that she wants to know that she's respected and that her viewpoints are respected, and everyone in that respect, is treated fairly. But I do think, again, when it goes a little overboard, then you can have people who do want to stifle the other argument, and that doesn't lead to truth. That's not the genuine, sincere debate that we should be having about very complex and difficult issues. Like I mainly focus on foreign policy. I mean, those are very difficult issues. I remember right after the invasion of Iraq, you couldn't say anything that was antithetical to the Bush administration. You were considered, in bed with bin Laden, and you were a treasonous appeaser. So it goes on the right and the left. You can see like people try to stifle free speech from the left or the right, and it's harmful to the discourse.
I think there's something to be said also for actually listening and not always feeling like I need to speak at all times. I think that it's important that we not obviously infringe on people's right to say things, but in like too strict of ways. But I think that at least in my experience at Cal and a lot of other people that I've talked to feel that you learn so much by listening to what somebody has experienced that sometimes it's, even though it might be hard to bite your tongue, that might be something that actually would help you learn and see through the eyes of somebody else. And so I think that even though it's important to make sure that people feel truly comfortable speaking out, and that includes people who are marginalized and not just the dominant view, that we should also be aware that, when you're actually listening to somebody else, that you are, in fact, participating in the discourse as well. And so we shouldn't really diminish the value of listening. And I think that that's something that folks should also consider in this conversation, too.
We've seen from multiple online and in here around the words have meaning, and we've talked about intent and impact. And what many folks are wondering is, why is impact more valid than intent?
Yeah. Well, I can certainly speak to that since I definitely think that. Well, I guess I would go back to the example of sexual harassment. So say somebody doesn't necessarily have the intent to sexually harass you, but the impact is that you feel incredibly uncomfortable in your class and you're not able to learn as effectively. What are the impacts of that? Maybe you were in a science class and it was a science TA or graduate student instructor who was committing this sexual harassment. And now you don't feel like you're welcome in that environment and you can't participate in class because you're afraid that by drawing attention to yourself, you could potentially be targeted for that. That's not uncommon. So sexual harassment, as an example, is something that happens very frequently, not just in the scientific disciplines, but all over academia and in the workplace, and is a very pervasive problem. But I think it's important to focus on the impact of that, because that has such a large influence on whether somebody ends up staying in that career or staying on that trajectory. So say you have been sexually harassed and you don't feel like you can be at that institution anymore. Well, then what if you decide, then maybe that means that you decide to go on a completely different career path. Again, this is not uncommon. And so I think that we have to realize that the words that we have and the kinds of things that we say to one another can impact whether or not you feel welcome in a space, which can have long-term consequences on what your career is, who you choose as friends, what environment you're living in. All of these kinds of things can be impacted by these kinds of incidents.
In terms of intent and impact, Sophie, we're getting a lot of folks that are wondering if you can apply intent versus impact to another situation that's not around sexual violence or sexual assault.
Yeah, okay.
I can, or do you?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, or one of you, but that was directed
Okay.
towards you. But if any of you want to take on that, that'd be great.
You want to start and I can finish, or?
Go for it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, sure. Okay, so another example that comes to mind is when I was in college, there was an effigy that was hanging from a fraternity, and it was right across the street from the African American Theme House program. The fraternity said, oh, this was just a Halloween decoration. We weren't trying to make anybody feel unsafe. But the impact that it had was that black students on campus felt extremely unsafe because it literally looked like there was a black dummy hanging from the fraternity window. That made them feel like this campus is not a safe space for me. And so that's an example of how some people might say, oh, the intent of the fraternity wasn't to have an image that resembled a lynching, right across the street from the Black Theme House program. But that's what happened. And so I think that it's important to recognize that even in cases that aren't sexual harassment, that can have adverse consequences on whether a person feels comfortable at that institution or in general.
I think for me, I think it depends on the situation and it depends on the context. For me, when it comes to political correctness, I think intent is almost all of it. I think that's at least 90 or 95% of it. But a situation where it's the reverse, where I think the impact matters more than the intent, would be again in policy realms. Whether that be, for instance, back in 2011, we overthrew the government in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. The intent was to help save the Libyan people. The impact has been that Libya is now in civil war. Al-Qaeda is establishing a base there. That wasn't our intent, but the impact is what matters. So I think it depends on the situation and what we're talking about. When it comes to policy, I think impact matters tremendously. Or look at the drug war. The drug war was meant to help clean our cities, our inner cities, and our communities. It's been incredibly detrimental to our inner cities and to our communities. So there, the drug war policy or foreign policy, impact matters, not so much intent. Yeah, a lot of questions.
So in terms of, we do have a lot of questions. In terms of wanting around then unintentional impact, we're wanting to know, is a person at fault if they have unintentional impact? In terms of my intent was this, but it was unintentional, the impact. What's the fault?
Well, I think that it depends on how you're responding to it. So, I mean, I've certainly been in situations where I did something unintentionally, and my gut reaction, of course, is to defend myself and to try and explain why I did something in a particular situation. But what I think would actually be more mature and would actually be more helpful to ensuring that people feel like it's a space that everyone can talk is to really reflect on what the impact of your words was and to try and put yourself in the shoes of the other person. So I can think back to a situation where somebody called me out for something and my instant reaction was that I felt like I should defend myself, but I ended up, taking a day to think about what the consequences of my words had been. And then I said, you know what, I apologize, you're right, I can see why you felt that way, and I will try to do better when I'm talking about those kinds of issues. And so I don't think that it's something that is impossible for us to do. It's to really try and think about how we can not jump to be so defensive immediately, but rather to acknowledge that what we did could have had an adverse impact on somebody and then try to move forward in the future from that.
From someone who is chronologically gifted as opposed to young.
Nice euphemism.
You like that one, huh? You just apologize. And you do it as soon as you recognize that you've made a mistake. And you learn from it.
Yeah. And it also depends on the reaction, right? So I'm very politically incorrect, in case you haven't found that out already. I've lost, my husband and I, we lost a friendship as a result of it. But we didn't know until months later that it was a result of something that we had said. And if I was given the opportunity to apologize, I would have. But now, because I wasn't given the opportunity to apologize, it almost makes me dig in a little harder. It's like, well, gosh darn it, I'm going to say what I want to say. And if it's going to offend someone, then I don't care. So I think it could also have the opposite reaction. And I think this is actually what you're seeing with the support of Donald Trump, is that people saying, yeah, I'm politically incorrect, and yeah, I'm going to say what I want, and I don't give a crap what the president says. I mean, it's almost, people identify with that. They identify with the political incorrectness, and that could be, I guess, a little dangerous, as we see.
We're wanting to know around how then we handle controversy. So when it comes to something as controversial as, say, the Confederate flag, how should controversy be addressed? And understanding of justification for both sides, how do we actually educate folks to understand multiple points of view?
My quick take is that I don't have a problem with people flying the Confederate flag. I have a huge problem with it flying on the state capital of South Carolina. That is preposterous.
There's a current situation happening on Stanford's campus, and I'd be very interested on what the panelists think of how that situation should be handled. The students are demanding that statues and recognition of a Catholic saint who helped found California, created a whole series of missionaries up and down the coast, be removed from campus, and in its place recognition of the indigenous peoples who occupied California should be put there. Should that happen or shouldn't it?
Do you know why they wanted to do that? Did they?
Well, the point was that they were taking the land from the indigenous people.
Okay.
So,
I don't know. I think it's tough because obviously there's a place of honor for someone who's given a distinction with a building or a name of a street, and so you're almost conferring again legitimacy to that person if they were perhaps very reprehensible. I know that on our alma mater, they're trying to rename Barrows Hall.
Yeah.
Because Barrows, he was a cultural anthropologist back at the turn of the century, and he referred to Filipinos as basically subhuman. It was just a horrible statement that he'd written. And there's a hall on the Berkeley campus called Barrows Hall. And so now there's this movement to rename it. I can understand and be sympathetic to why it should be renamed, but I almost worry about the opposite happening, of us whitewashing history, of us not recognizing that fact. And I think it becomes problematic. We should know our history. Maybe the best way isn't to honor those who are racist or bigoted or misogynistic, but we should know more about our history instead of just trying to push it under the rug.
I think that we can learn about our history without conferring honor and legitimacy onto people who acted in ways that are appalling to us today and can make people feel like they're not welcome members of that particular environment. So, I mean, personally, I would support both of those campaigns. Yeah.
I'd say recognize them both. You know.
Oh man, then we have to rename Washington D.C. and Washington
you
State.
don't rename anything. You just, you don't take down the name of Carnegie, who set up all the libraries across our country because he was involved with slaves. You don't do that. But you recognize that that was the case. I don't think we in this generation have the opportunity to redo what prior generations have done in order to recognize those who they saw advance society.
One of the questions we keep getting is around First Amendment, and they want to know, does First Amendment protect both verbal bullies and cyber bullies?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is.
From what I understand, yes. I mean, there are very strict parameters around free speech and what is and is not protected. For instance, I can threaten someone with bodily harm who happens to be, say, Chinese. I would be thrown in jail or something, not because I said that the person was Chinese, but because I made that threat of imminent harm. So it's the threat of imminent harm that is not protected. I think that's really the crux of this. So sadly, I mean, I don't like cyberbullies. I think they're horrible. I mean, they're like schools of fish. They just swarm around and they start attacking people. I don't like it or support it, but it's difficult.
I mean, I think that there are actions that can be taken against cyberbullies that don't. I mean, I don't think that we should be like throwing people in prison necessarily, for cyberbullying. I think that there are actions that can be taken, though, to show the person who was bullying the other person that that is not okay behavior. And I mean, speaking as somebody who felt in middle school like I actually did experience various forms of bullying, yeah, I would have loved it if somebody had actually said something to those kids. Like, that would have been great. That would have made me feel a lot more comfortable on my middle school campus. And actually something that ended up happening in the middle school was that during Spanish class, all of the girls who were being bullied by the boys all of the time would go to a therapy session in the basement during Spanish class every other week, while the boys would be allowed to stay and take Spanish. And so this was the kind of solution that the teachers had at the time for this, as opposed to telling those people who were bullying the girls, this is not tolerable behavior. So I think that there are definitely interim actions that can be taken that are short of, putting somebody in prison that can deter cyberbullying and other types of bullying.
Right. For lack of a better answer, I think we just have to sort of police ourselves. Maybe something leads to social ostracism, and that's what we see now. I mean, I think that's the best way to handle these sorts of issues.
When someone does say something you find inappropriate, so that's so gay or this is so retarded, we're being asked around what should you do with a peer, coworker, or a colleague? What are thoughts from our panel around addressing that behavior?
So I actually was able to be part of a hackathon, which is like very much outside of my realm of things. And somebody there came up with this kind of app where basically it was called like Think Twice About It, where if somebody said something offensive, then there would or something that made you feel like you were uncomfortable, like one of those two examples, that you could have a text that would be sent to that person, just kind of explaining why that made you feel like it's not okay to say those kinds of things without revealing your identity necessarily. So that's one idea. But in general, I mean, it's definitely hard to call people out for things. But I think that there are, again, ways that you can do that that are, not too aggressive or awkward, but also make the point that it's not okay to say things like that because of how they're reinforcing these various social stereotypes that exist.
Many organizations in the public, private, academic sector have HR departments that deal and handle these things. And so it's an independent third party that can hear the complaint and can go back and talk to the individual and deal with it. And I think that's a nice way to do it because it's very hard to do it face to face with the individual.
Yeah, I think, you just pull the person aside and you tell them respectfully, that's not okay. My mom is from a different generation. She used to refer to Arabs as camel jockeys, and I said, Mom, you can't say that. That's highly offensive. That's not something that's okay. And now she's changed her language, and so I think sometimes it is generational. And you don't want to say something, like I said in the previous example, you don't want to give someone justification to dig in their heels. So the worst thing you can probably do is just be aggressive and dismiss them outright because they're going to feel like they're being attacked. And it's almost ironic, like they feel that they're being attacked, but they're saying things that are very offensive and controversial. So I think you just pull them aside and say respectfully, that's not okay, and you say this is the reason why, and you don't want to say that in polite company, or else you may not be invited to the next dinner party.
Yeah, but if that person happens to be your boss, it's a lot harder to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
This
in
is
the
my mom,
workplace,
so yeah.
forget that approach.
Yeah.
So they would like you three to weigh in on Redskins NFL name change.
Oh, boy. How about the Chicago Blackhawks? Same thing.
Or the Fighting Sioux.
Yeah.
Oh, they did? Yeah, there you go. I think it's up to the owners. Don't pelt me with tomatoes, please. I think it's up to the owners. I think we live in this free market economy, and I think unfortunately sometimes they make decisions and we can't force them. I think what we can do is we can voluntarily decide not to go to their sporting events. We can voluntarily decide not to purchase their merchandise. That's the way you change that. But I don't think there should be some executive decree that says that the Redskins must change their name.
Of course, the NCAA has taken a different stance on that in every college campus, and all the Indian names are gone across the country. I don't think there's any left that I know about. Are there? Well, yeah, that's right. So what has been the retribution in that case?
And the Fighting Irish.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they did.
Okay,
But see, there
that's
we go. That's if
Yeah.
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think that it's important to listen to the concerns of the people who are being affected. So if you have lots of indigenous folks who are saying, I really don't want this football team to be called what it's called, then I think that should be taken into consideration. And so I do personally support the name changes.
Many folks have noted that there seems to be a generational difference around political correctness. So we're wanting to know if that is true, if yes, why, and if not, why not? Do you think that political correctness is about generations?
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, we all were born in a different period and grew up in a different period and have different relationships and language skills with one another. So I think it's very natural that we have differences.
Just recently, I went on Netflix and I was going to watch an Eddie Murphy stand-up comedy routine, and I had to turn it off after the first 10 minutes because he kept using the F word. It's the F word that ends with a G. And it's a way to describe gay people. And so, I mean, I was offended, and so I turned it off. But for other people, I mean, this came out in the early 80s where it was socially acceptable to say those things. And so it's totally different. We just live in a different environment, and we're making space for people in a way that they can feel more comfortable, and that's understandable.
So Sophie, you keep talking about around marginalized groups and giving them voice or thinking about trigger warnings or being politically correct. So does giving preferential political correctness to marginalized group marginalize the speech of the general public?
No.
No, I don't think so.
Say more.
Well, okay. So essentially, I am of the opinion that if you are from like a dominant group, so like for instance, I am a white woman who went to UC Berkeley. I am straight. I have a lot of privilege. People generally listen to a lot of things that I say because of the position that I have in society. Is that fair? I don't think so. I think that I was born into a situation of privilege, and that is not something that I can change, obviously, but that's the situation that I'm in. And so I think that I am not, or I don't think that anyone is trying to take away from or dehumanize people who come from privileged communities. I think that we're trying to uplift the voices of people who have so systemically been oppressed. It's not that we want to tear other people down, but it's that we want to raise up the voices of others. So I really don't think that we're in any way marginalizing people who are from very dominant areas of society by making sure that we're listening to other people who haven't been heard.
I would add one thing. I think it depends on the situation. For instance, I don't know if you've seen this. There's this video, it was released last week, of a black student antagonizing a white student who had dreadlocks because he was white with dreadlocks. I don't like dreadlocks, but I don't care if you wear dreadlocks. And I think that's an example of the cultural appropriation, what I call cultural protectionism, is that sometimes those of the marginalized groups can feel that others who are taking parts or elements of their culture, it's an infringement on their own culture. I already gave examples of why I think that shouldn't be the case for globalization reasons and everything. So yeah.
We're aware of time, so we can just take a couple of more questions. And one of the ones that has come up at least 17 times is around Halloween costumes. And we're wondering if you all can weigh in on politically correct. Should we give trigger warnings before I wear a Halloween costume? Should I be conscious of my Halloween costume? So if you all can weigh in on Halloween costumes, we'd appreciate it.
Okay, so one thing that comes to mind when I think about this Halloween costume stuff is that there was somebody who, this circulated around the internet, someone had dressed up as the victim of a shooting, I believe a victim of Newtown shooting or something like that. Do I think that people should do that? No. I think that people should, again, use common sense when they're dressing up. I don't think that that's appropriate. I think that if we're talking about other instances of Halloween costumes where people are like having a theme part, for example, like a Mexican sombrero themed party, those kinds of things happen all the time. Often all of the participants are white and they're basically poking fun at Latino culture, whether they recognize it or not. I don't think that that should be happening either. I am of the belief that you should not mock other cultures in that kind of way. And again, I don't think that that's a particularly extreme position. I think that we can, it's Halloween. People dress up in lots of crazy costumes. I don't think that you have to offend somebody to do that.
It's up to the individual. What about a toga party? Are you up for a toga party?
The marginalized Romans.
Yeah, the
Marginalized
Romans.
Romans. It's a different situation.
Absolutely.
Again, I have mixed feelings about this. I think it's inappropriate, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
Say more. That was not answering.
Oh,
Give
okay,
us
well,
more. Come on.
I think I can understand why people get offended by it, in the sense that you can't reduce what is a very complex idea of someone's identity or someone's culture and reduce it to something that's just like a sombrero or a tequila bottle or a cactus or insert crude stereotype here. So I understand the concern, is that you're taking something that's very complex and very dynamic and very fluid and reducing it to something that's become a mockery. I understand that. I guess my tolerance of these things is fairly high. I think that people, when we talk about cultural appropriation, it could be also cultural appreciation. Would they otherwise talk about Mexican parties, or would they otherwise talk about black themes or those things? Are they only supposed to celebrate and do things that are of their own culture? Again, I mean, are we talking about a monopoly on someone's expression and how they express themselves? I think it's very difficult. I mean, I may find it offensive, but again, I think it's okay.
Our final comment has been around political or ideology, and they're wondering if political correctness or triggering engenders a certain political ideology. Sure. So we're wondering if, lots of the questions have been, is this just a liberal ideology? Is political correctness, does it engender just a certain type of belief system around politics? Is it a conservative? Is it a liberal? So that has come up multiple times around, does political correctness just term you around a political ideology?
I think it is often labeled liberal, but I would be the first to say it's also very conservative. Again, and I give the example of right after the Iraq War. You cannot be critical of the Bush administration without, again, being a treasonous appeaser, or you're in bed with the terrorists, or you're in line with Saddam Hussein. So unless you're like, waving the big foam finger, number one, America, 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 rah, 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 you were hyper-criticized. And from the conservative bent, from the right, you were criticized. So I think it can cut both ways. I think oftentimes it's considered liberal to be politically correct, but it also can be very right-wing, very nationalistic, very almost quasi-fascistic. It's very much of a certain way of thinking, very pro-America, very pro-interventionist. And so you do see it on the other side of not being very critical of America.
I think that's a very fair statement. I too have seen it on both sides, though I think it leans more to the left than the right. But it's there. We live with it all the time, and we will have to live with it.
We're aware of time, so we wanted to allow our panelists just 1 minute or 2 minutes to kind of recap their thoughts around our panel today, and then we will end our session. Sophie, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I am definitely a proponent of treating people with respect, making people feel like they are welcome in situations that are dominated by other groups. And I think that it's important to recognize the importance of listening to the voices of people who have often not been heard, and that when we're saying things that are really offensive and are and things that are not in good taste, that can actually stifle conversations that we should be having about important issues in our society. So I encourage you not to think about political correctness as something that is stifling conversation, but rather I think you should think about it as making sure that we're giving space to people who have typically not been listened to.
And thank you all for staying, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I've learned an awful lot. I learned what definition of trigger points is. To begin with, I think the guy who dressed up like in Halloween, like somebody was a school shooting, should find him some psychological help. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy to do that. Very, very tough subject. I think we leave today. We realize it's a gray area to a large extent, and we just have to keep in mind what our Constitution says and what it's important to us in being, sympathetic, empathetic to each other. Thank you.
I think I'll end with 2 quotes. One of them is George Carlin, again in the book Brain Droppings, where he says, some psychologists are now referring to ugly people as people with severe appearance deficits. so it's sort of a mockery. But I'll end my talk with a quote from John Cleese, the comedian. And he says, quote, "If people can't control their own emotions, then they have to start controlling other people's behavior." So when you feel yourself getting worked up, tighten your sphincter muscles, compose yourself, and realize that even if you're offended, direct your energies in a very positive way. Pull the person aside, tell them that it's inappropriate, but watch out because it can easily backlash into something that someone, again, they dig in their heels and they become even more politically incorrect. Learn to control your own emotions. Don't try and control other people.
You can join me in thanking our panelists this afternoon. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Sophie. I enjoyed it. You got a hell of a future. I'm going to have to keep